He is president and chief executive officer of Oxy. She's been a member of Oxy's board of directors since 2015. Her 35-year career at Oxy, Vicki has held a variety of management and technical positions, has had responsibilities on 3 continents, including roles in the United States and Russia, Venezuela, Ecuador. More recently, Vicki has served as Oxy's president and chief operating officer. She oversees all the company's oil and gas, chemical, and midstream operations. Vicki is also chair of the World Economic Forum's oil and gas community and a member of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. As I was mentioning, public-private partnership is such a critical necessity to accelerate deployment at scale, right, in our country and globally. And Vicki and her colleagues at Occidental have been just such a wonderful partner to work with for so many years. There's been a number of energy, ministerial meetings on a number of continents, I think, that we've been at, whether it's formal meetings as part of the United Nations, Climate Week, IEA gatherings. Vicki has just been one of those leaders and champions that we need, right, to work public-private fashion to accelerate CCS deployment. So it is a wonderful honor, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation with Vicki Hollub today. Excellent. All right. Thank you for joining us.
I'll just say I'm so happy to be here. You'll notice my voice is a little odd. I've had a sinus infection, not contagious at this point. But a few days ago I had no voice, and I might go into a coughing seizure. Okay. Don't worry, I'll survive it. But I really wanted to be here because this institute and the people involved here now are doing an incredible job to advance what needs to happen for our climate transition. And I so much respect and appreciate what this institute does. I didn't want to miss this opportunity to participate in this and to be here with you, Jarad.
Yeah, no, well, we're delighted to have you here, and I look forward to this conversation. It's going to be fun, and hopefully it's informative as well. Maybe to start us off, right? I mean, it's been such a dynamic time over the last couple of years, right? I mean, we had the pandemic and all the perturbations that caused. We've had the unfortunate situation now with Russia and Ukraine, and I know that certainly impacted a number of energy markets in Europe and specifically, but the ripple effect globally. Could you just start off our conversation and take a few minutes to sort of, from your perspective, sort of give an overview of what you see as the critical parts of sort of the recent past and maybe where you see things going in the near future?
Well, I think to look at the situation that the world is in now, with all that's happened, I think now more than ever before, we really have to think about how can we ensure that geographical regions and countries around the globe do have the opportunity for energy security. And sometimes we use the term energy independence, and when that term is used, some people get a little agitated about that, thinking that energy independence means that you have to produce 100% of what you need. That's not necessarily the case. The case is that if you can produce the majority of what you need and in a crisis situation have the resources to get to 100% of what you need if needed, then that's energy independence. And here in the United States, we have that. And we have that today. And although we are importing oil, the reality is that if we needed to ramp up production over time, now it's difficult because of the supply chain issues caused by the pandemic, but we have the resources and capability over time to get back to a higher level of production in the United States. I think what's happening in Europe should be a case study for all of us, that the climate transition needs to happen, and it can happen. The good thing about what we've seen in Europe is renewables have grown significantly. And wind and solar are much more commercial today than what they were initially. And that just proves that technology can be developed and you can reduce cost of technology over time. So that's an important thing to remember about what we're doing in CCS. And for those people that think it's too expensive, remember, technology can be improved over time, as we've seen the case study proven by the wind and solar industries. But getting back, the other case study for Europe is how do you make a climate transition happen, and happen in a way that's fast enough for us to meet the goals of the Paris Accord by 2050, but also ensure that we're not putting countries or regions at risk from a security standpoint, and that we're not leaving those in developing countries behind. We enjoyed all the things that that oil helped to do in terms of fueling the Industrial Revolution here in the United States and in Europe. And the Middle East now, you look at what's happened in the Middle East, you go to those cities and countries, and the quality of infrastructure that they've been able to build is amazing. And so we need that to happen in the developing countries. So how do we make all of that happen? And how do we fund it? A lot of people are estimating the energy transition will cost $100 to $200 trillion. And quite frankly, we cannot afford that. We cannot afford to pay that unless we do our transition in a smarter way. And that's what makes this institute so important, is we have to include carbon capture, use, and sequestration in the equation to make the energy transition happen. And that's what we're committed to being a part of doing, and to showing that over time, that's the only way that we can avoid damaging a lot of countries and having people continue to die from the use of the wrong kind of energy and harmful energy, to a point where we can get everyone hopefully closer to where the United States is with respect to quality of life.
Yeah, no, and I think it's interesting that, you know, it's not an either or, right? We need to find a path to sustainability and energy security, and balance at the same time.
Exactly.
And I know you've been playing a leading role in where you operate and in the industry at large, right? In terms of saying that's clearly a technology-enabled pathway, and CCS, from your perspective and in your business line, is a large part of that. Could you sort of just maybe dive into a little bit of how you see the application of CCS allowing you as a head of a large company to determine what's that strategy going forward, where you do find that balance between energy security and a business model that is sustainable, and at the same time moving toward a lower carbon footprint?
Yeah, we've had the advantage of being able to leverage our core competence of having operated CO2 enhanced oil recovery floods in the Permian Basin now for more than 40 years. Those CO2 floods that we operate today, most of that CO2 is coming from organic sources. And ultimately, our goal is to convert that, the organic CO2 to anthropogenic and atmospheric. And what's so important, though, about understanding that technology and understanding how it works and how to make it be productive and produce a lower carbon barrel of oil, is to understand how CO2 works in the reservoir. And this is a message that, if we're unable to get the world to understand this message, then that's what's going to make the energy transition much more difficult. So a lot of people, when they think about CCS, they think they leave the U out. It's carbon capture and sequestration is what most people want to have happen. And while we're going to do some of that, in fact, we've just announced a couple of hubs in Louisiana where for those companies that we're dealing with that want and will only buy CO2 credits if they're sequestered, that's a service we will provide, because we need to do, as Jarad said, all of the above. But the thing to understand that about enhanced oil recovery and why it's so important and why it's a key to funding and making the transition happen is that it takes more CO2 injected into a reservoir than what the oil, incremental oil that CO2 generates will emit when used. So you can actually generate net negative or net neutral, net zero carbon oil from an enhanced oil recovery project. And the way it works is that in reservoirs, in primary production, in most reservoirs around the world, you can get 15 to 20 or 30% primary production. That's without any assistance. But then you can water flood beyond that to get a little bit more, or if you have a natural water flood in the reservoir, you can get then up to another 20% or so. But then you leave, potentially in the ground, you leave 50 to 60% of the oil in the ground. So all the reservoirs around the world, we're leaving, we put all this infrastructure in. We put pipelines, we put facilities that process the oil and gas. We build all of that. all that infrastructure creates a carbon footprint. The steel, the cement, all the manufacturing that we do to make the vessels, all of that creates a carbon footprint. So every time you develop a new reservoir, you have to put all that new infrastructure in. So my company, Occidental, and even the IEA, Fatty Burrell with the IEA, believes that the more oil we can get out of existing reservoirs, the lower the carbon footprint of the oil and gas industry over time. And the way you make that happen is to use CO2 in the reservoir. And you ask, so how do you sequester the CO2 in an oil reservoir? What happens is, and the reason you don't get 100% of the oil in the reservoir is because the reservoir is not a big cavern, like some people think. It's actually, if you look at your countertop, and whether it's corian or marble or granite, whatever your countertop is in your kitchen at home, that's essentially what the reservoir looks like. And you can't see porosity in that countertop. When we take our cores from reservoirs, we can't see porosity with the naked eye. But that's what a reservoir looks like. And it has these tiny, even though you can't see the porosity with your eye, there's even smaller porosity that even with a microscope is hard to see. And that's where the oil is trapped, because the oil cannot get out of those tiny little micropores because of its viscosity. But when you inject CO2, and that CO2 becomes miscible in that oil, so it dissolves into the oil, it expands the oil molecule and it lowers its viscosity, and then it makes that oil molecule pop out of that space where it otherwise would have been trapped forever. But something has to replace that. You don't just get an air void because there's no air down in the reservoir. So that CO2 molecule goes into that spot where that oil molecule came out. So CO2 then is sequestered forever in that reservoir. And the important thing is to know that it is sequestration. It's the same as sequestration in a saline reservoir, except that it's generating incremental oil. And that's where it comes in, that you have to do the math that more CO2 has to be injected into the reservoir than what the barrel of oil produced from that CO2 will emit. And if you can get that concept and you can understand that, and it's not an easy concept, you really have to think about it. If we can get the world to accept that, then what we can do is lower the carbon footprint of the oil and gas future development and future production. And that's what's important for the world. The last barrel of oil produced in the world should come from a CO2 enhanced oil recovery reservoir, because it will be a carbon net zero barrel. And so that's what we're trying to promote. And we're trying to make this transition so that everybody's comfortable with it. So we feel like that all of the above has to happen. We have to have nuclear happening, we have to have wind, we have to have solar, and we need CO2 enhanced oil recovery to happen in the world. And the incremental oil will help to fund the transition, because otherwise it's going to be incredibly expensive. And when you look at the developing countries that have all these oil and gas resources to develop so that they can achieve the same quality of life that we have here in the United States, we need to allow them to be able to develop those reservoirs, but in a carbon neutral way. And starting out and helping them, we want to advance this technology fast enough so that we can help them get there before they're too far along in the development of their resources.
Yeah, no, and I think it's interesting, right? I mean, I think that you said a couple of things that I'll amplify here. One is we need to continue to provide energy services. We need to do that in a lower and lower carbon footprint way. One way that you and your colleagues are looking is how do you leverage the infrastructure that you already have?
Right.
And another point you made is, you need to look at this from a life cycle perspective and say, what is the overall footprint of that entire system, and that's what we need to reduce, right? And so,
exactly.
From an enhanced oil recovery perspective, moving from what occurred in history to where it is now, to moving toward eventually a model where you put more CO2 in the ground,
exactly.
right, as you go forward and lower that carbon footprint. Absolutely crystal clear. I know one of the actions that you have taken and the leadership you've shown in that regard in terms of where you source that CO2 is the work that Oxy's been doing with carbon engineering on direct air capture. Could you just spend a couple of minutes to talk about that journey that you've been on and where you see Oxy's investments in direct air capture as part of your overall strategy?
Yeah, I would say that as we learned more about what was happening to the climate as a result of CO2 emissions and methane emissions, we became convinced that we needed to convert as quickly as we can from organic to anthropogenic and atmospheric CO2. And so we were all excited about it. And to be completely transparent, the other thing is we knew that for all the resources that we can develop here in the United States, there's not enough organic CO2 that you can produce to make it feasible, you could economically use. And so that started us down the path of trying to figure out how do we get CO2 from other sources, and can we use anthropogenic, and can we make that conversion? And then as we were going down that path, we realized what was happening to the climate as a result of the CO2, and we became even more committed that we had to make this transition, we had to do it quickly, and we had to develop a technology that would make it feasible for others to do too. And so our first thing was to go knocking on the doors of all the emitters around the Permian Basin, and then we expanded out beyond that to come to the Gulf Coast and other places to say, hey, we have this great idea, we want to take your emissions, use it in our enhanced soil recovery reservoirs, ultimately stop the organic use. And what we found is most of the people we talked to said that's a really, really, really great idea, and we definitely want to stop emitting this CO2 into the atmosphere, but how much is it going to cost, and are you guys going to pay for it? And to your point, Jarad, and what's going to be talked about later today at this conference is how do you pay for it? So for years, we worked this idea trying to get companies to partner with us to make this happen. And the only company that stepped up and said, okay, yeah, we have the same passion you do, and we're on the same page with you, and we'll do it, was White Energy in their 2 ethanol plants in Texas. They were the only company willing, and their board of directors was very adamant that we need to capture the CO2. And so we're working with them now to make that happen. And it's taken several years to make that happen. And so what we then found out is, as we were going down this path, is we ran across a company called Carbon Engineering who had a technology to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. And to us, that became a great solution because then we didn't have to talk anybody else into partnering with us. We didn't have to go to a refinery or a cement plant or steel plant and try to talk them into putting carbon capture on their facility, which is a daunting task when you have shareholders. Everybody, all the public companies have shareholders we have to deal with, and every time we talk to anybody about it, they thought, what's the cost going to be? What's the impact going to be on our shareholders? And can we make it happen? And it's almost like you can't make it happen unless everybody commits to make it happen, because then you don't have that disadvantage from an economic standpoint. So we decided direct air capture we can be in complete control of. We don't need anybody else to partner with us. We can just go do it. And I applaud Senator Heidi Heitkamp, Brad Crabtree for putting together the means for us to improve 45Q enough where we were able to make the decision a few years ago because of the enhancements to 45Q that we were going to move forward to do this. And it wasn't a break-even proposition at that time, but we decided we would move forward anyway and control our own destiny. And so we partnered with, bought equity actually in Carbon Engineering, started looking for a contractor worldwide to help us do this. And the technology ended up being something that's so synergistic with our chemicals business in that, to extract CO2 out of the atmosphere, you have to have these huge radial fans that'll push the CO2 through a contact tower. And then when it contacts a fluid in that tower, that fluid can extract the CO2 out of the air and then return or capture the CO2, help us get it to the reservoir or sequestration, and then send the rest of the air back out to the atmosphere. And so the fluid that's needed to do that is potassium hydroxide, which we're the largest marketer of in the United States and second largest in the world. And then the other thing that's synergistic is we make and sell PVC too, and to make the air mix better with the fluid that we're using in the contact tower, we have to have PVC as kind of buffers in that contact tower to make it mix good enough that the efficiency of pulling that CO2 out of the atmosphere, out of the air is good enough from a commercial standpoint. And so we make PVC too. So we had that synergy. We're going to build the first one in the Permian because that's where we already have infrastructure and have the capability to either sequester it or put it in an enhanced oil recovery reservoir. So all of those things came together to make it possible for us to move forward with that technology. And we believe it's going to be revolutionary. We believe that we can do it at a large scale and make it more efficient over time. Some people say it's too expensive, but again, this is technology. You can't make it better until you build the first one and improve it over time. And I think there are a couple of people with Climeworks here. I have to give a shout out to Climeworks. They're doing it. They're pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, and they're sequestering it underground in a unique way. And they've moved forward with it, and I'm sure their costs are improving as they increase their volumes, and I applaud them for being bold enough to move forward with that. We want to do the same thing, and we think that ultimately this will be a solution because the atmosphere right now has 50% more CO2 than it did in pre-industrial time. So no matter, even if we put capture on every emitting facility today, we would still need to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Yeah, well, and again, thank you. I think it's a great example of your leadership moving forward in this area, an example of, the time constant it takes to actually methodically think about how you do this, find good business partners to work. A great example of a government role in 45Q of, absent a market driver now, government policy tools and incentives that are used to catalyze first movers in this space, right? And, I think at the end of the day, the point is you need to find a business model that's sustainable, right? And CCS, whether it's direct air capture or point source capture that you mentioned with White Energy, needs to ultimately be investable if we're all going to work together and get this to scale like the climate math says we must do, right, to solve our problems. A question for you on that in terms of the financeability and the business model that works given here in the United States context and perhaps globally as well. From your perspective, what's the role of carbon markets? From where I sit, I see these as potentially being instrumental, again, to catalyze some of these first mover projects and opportunities. From your perspective, do you have thoughts on the role that carbon markets are currently playing or might play in the future?
That's another thing I'm really excited about. You may not know this. I didn't know this. William on our team pulled together this, wherever William is, pulled together this information for me. But there's more than 5,000 corporations in the world that have committed to be net zero by 2050. And what that means is there are not enough natural ways to sequester CO2, not enough nature ways to do it. So we're going to need carbon capture and sequestration to happen. And so now corporations are stepping up and they're working out their ways to make that happen. And what we're excited about is we have not talked to all the 5,000, although I hope our team initially will get that done. We've got the list, but we've talked to a lot of corporations who are very sincere about this and taking the steps necessary. So there is a voluntary market that's growing, and the voluntary market, I believe, will help us to advance the technology. We could do it much faster if we could get enhancements to 45Q, and if we could get direct pay for 45Q rather than having to involve maybe a tax equity, a partner, which just makes the negotiations more complex and longer to make happen. But the reality is that the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard has been helpful, and and more like that would be helpful. But in 45Q, the DOE having programs to support infrastructure, all of those things that help us build the technology, which enables us to then make the technology better, is the way that we're going to be able to advance this faster. So we do need 45Q to accelerate it, but the voluntary markets are developing, and we believe that based on the commitments and the sincerity of the corporations that are making those commitments, we believe that that market will help also to fund the technology.
Yeah, excellent. And I see some economist friends in the audience here locally nodding up and down, agreeing with you on the unnecessary added complexities of tax equity. And if we could move past that, it may be more,
Anybody that can help.
efficient. I've got one final quick question for you before we open it up to some audience questions. I know there's probably a number of folks that want to take opportunity and ask you a question specifically. But from where we are now to where we need to get, and all the climate math says gigaton scale, in just a sort of a short synopsis, what is your view of the path we all collectively need to take to get there as rapidly as we can?
I think more collaboration, and I think across segment, across industry sector collaboration, we have to make this happen faster. The agreements and the things necessary to advance the projects have to happen faster. This kind of forum where we can come together and talk about it and analyze all the issues, this kind of effort is really important for moving some of the obstacles that we face on a daily basis to get this done.
Excellent. Well, and again, as I said in my opening, I think the Institute is well positioned to host these types of conversations, and I fully agree with you. This is the type of discussion we have, and again, I'm excited. I think I could stay up here and talk with you all day, but time is running short, and I know we have another keynote speaker, but we do have time for some questions for Vicki from the audience, I think just locally here, and I see Richard Esposito from Southern Company has his hand up, and wait, please, Richard, until the mic comes your way.
Hello? Okay. Thanks, Vicki. I love your description at EOR. I hope someone was recording that and posts it on YouTube, as many people need to hear that. For the DAC project, I've heard 1 million tons a year. Are you guys going for 1 million tons a year initially, or are you going to phase it in and different levels of capture?
What we're going to do is we don't want to advance so fast that we don't take advantage of optimization early on. So what we're going to do is build the first train of 500,000 tons per year. And as we're building that, we're going to build a digital twin. And we're going to make this as technologically advanced as possible. So we'll overspend on the first one just to ensure that we're taking advantage of all the things that we can do. In fact, I saw yesterday in my office a robotic dog that's going to be going through the facility, checking measurements and doing all sorts of things. So we're putting advanced technology in the first one. It will be more expensive, but ultimately the ones that we build after that will be 1 million tons per year. I just saw Secretary Granholm come in.
I did too, but she just sat down. But
I don't think I should be up here with
Secretary
in the room.
That makes two of us, but I think we
would rather hear from you.
We've got a few more minutes, and I've got plenty of questions. I don't know if our audience has questions either, but we've got another one in the back. Jeff, you want to help with the microphone back there? And I'm sure
Thanks,
we'll
Vicki.
get the signal.
This is John Mossop from DrillQuip. I admire the stance you're taking on direct air capture. I'm kind of interested in the roadmap for that technology development, and how long do you think that will take? What do you need? What partnerships do you need to find, et cetera, et cetera?
I'm glad you asked that question because wind and solar took a while, but wind and solar have reduced their cost by about 80% on each of those costs. It took them years to do that, but they didn't have back then the computing capability that the world has today. So building a digital twin as we go and optimizing that as we're building the very first train or the first unit, I think is going to help us to advance the technology and the cost of that. And I don't expect us to see dramatic improvements, probably not in the first 10 facilities, but we do believe that we'll be able to advance it a lot faster than wind and solar just because of the fact that we can build digital twins right now, and they couldn't back then. They didn't have that capability. So I do believe that from the first 10 or so to, we have it as an nth number, it'll follow the same Moore's curve of technology development. I think that we will get this down to less than $100 a ton soon enough to accelerate it around the world and to hopefully get these built in a big enough way to achieve our goals and the goals of the Paris Accord.
Yeah, and I think, getting from first-of-a-kind costs that we see today to nth-of-a-kind, clearly that's in everybody's best interest. Finding ways to work together to do that, I think is going to be instrumental to, what's that most efficient path forward. Clearly there's role for government, clearly there's role for, really leaders of industry that are gonna do that first-of-a-kind and then hopefully work together to get us to the second-of-a-kind and down to that curve, as best we can. We may have room for one more final question in the back before we should probably give.
Yeah, hi. You explained it really well. Thank you. Fast forward 2150. What is the likelihood that people at the time may think that it's an environmental disaster, carbon capture and storage? Have we done enough tests about it to see that there would be no negative consequences down the line?
I can tell you what I have zero concerns about, and that is that we can store CO2 in reservoirs. Because the reality is that the hydrocarbons that we produce today have been stored in reservoirs for millions of years. And so I don't have any concerns about the reservoir being able to keep the CO2 stored safely. What we do need to be sure of is the mechanical integrity of the wells that we drill. And that has to be advanced technology, and it has to be monitored. And we're doing that today because we inject CO2 every day in our enhanced oil recovery projects. And EPA has a good process that they use, and it's called MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification of the CO2, that it goes into the reservoir and is not coming out in a way that you don't need it to come. And so that MRV plan, we were the first U.S. oil and gas company to get the first one, and we got the first two, and now we have three. But that's a good program to that, and a lot of people fought that because they didn't want to have to do all the measurements and all the monitoring because it's expensive, but it's necessary, and we already had that in place. And so you're right, you do have to monitor it, but the only risk is that if you don't drill your well and secure the casing and the tubing properly, that's the only risk. And you can put monitoring on that to ensure that it's not leaking.
And there are regulations to ensure that. And again, back to your point, this has been stored by Mother Nature for tens of millions of years. And if we choose our spots, responsibly and well, we can do this too for the sake of climate change mitigation.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Vicki, it is always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for coming out here and taking the time to be with all of us today. And again, thank you for your leadership in CCS. It's just a great example of, again, what's required to get us from where we are to where we need to be, where all the climate math needs to be. There's a role for government, there's a role for industry leaders, there's a role to engage the finance sector. And again, thank you for your leadership and doing your part.
Thank you, and thank you all of you for being here and for participating and contributing to the advancement of this.
Great, thank you.